Welcome to Sir Henry Fraser, His Life in Focus. I'm Miles Eversley. Thanks for joining us. Sir Henry continues his autobiographical journey in the year 1970.
After my wife and I got married in May of 1970, we then returned to Jamaica. Now, I think I just mentioned that I had always planned to return to Jamaica because I'd worked out my own postgraduate training to become a qualified internist and researcher with Sir George Alleyne. My wife wasn't quite sure what she wanted to do, and I saved her from going back to the frozen north in Aberdeen, where she had trained, by marrying her and persuading her to come to Jamaica with me. So off we went to Jamaica. I went up and I arrived in Jamaica first, while she stayed on for a few days longer here, because I wanted to find a flat and not inconvenience her. And so I stayed with friends until we found an apartment. And we found an apartment with a lovely lady called Mrs. Rousseau. And we were very closely connected with the Rousseau family, because my very good friend, Ren Holness, who became professor of neurology in Halifax and a very eminent and distinguished professor of neurosurgery in Halifax, Ren's sister, Beverly, who had been Miss Mona Heights, an absolutely beautiful lady, she had married one of the three Rousseau brothers, Peter Rousseau. And Pat Rousseau is well known across the Caribbean because Pat, the older brother, an attorney, he became the chairman of the West Indies Cricket Board for many years. And I think he was a pretty good chairman. Now, their mother, Enid Rousseau, was a lovely lady. She was very, very large. She was rather shaped like a tent. And she was known to all of her friends as Fatty. And she was the most wonderful person. She was our surrogate mother in Jamaica. And she had built onto her house a wonderful one-bedroom apartment. And so my friend Ren organized for us to live in that fabulous apartment. And it meant that we were close neighbors of Fatty. And Fatty had a fantastic cook called Vi. And Vi cooked all the great Jamaican dishes to perfection. So she taught Maureen to produce ackee and saltfish and Jamaican peas and rice and things like that, you know. And we lived in this beautiful little apartment with a magnificent view of the Blue Mountains. And as I've said, the Blue Mountains were a tremendous source of inspiration. I went there as often as I could, and I painted them as often as I could. So it was a great environment for us to actually live in. But Jamaica was quite a cultural transformation for Maureen, because it was a very different place to Barbados. We both worked at the hospital. We both had junior jobs at the hospital. I began my postgraduate career with a stint in pathology. Now, pathology is human tissue. It's looking for the abnormal human tissue. And it does a wonderful job when it can identify disease in life through biopsies. But it also looks at postmortems after death to try to find out the cause of death and hopefully inform us, inform the doctors, inform everyone caring the patient who died exactly why they died. And sometimes to pick up errors of judgment, things that might have been diagnosed in life but were not. And so it's a great teaching opportunity for a young doctor. And I really love pathology. I love the beautiful pictures under the microscope, which appeal to my artistic instinct. And I liked finding the solutions. It's a kind of detective story, pathology and postmortems, and I really enjoyed that. And the professor of pathology was a very famous man, a great man called Professor Gerrit Brass. He looked after his junior staff, and as soon as we met on my first day in his department, he said, "Now, have you got a car?" And I said, "No, I haven't got a car yet. I've got a borrowed vehicle." And he said, "Well, you know, my mechanic bought a beautiful little Volkswagen for his wife, and then they had a quarrel. And as a result of that quarrel, she deliberately rammed the car and had an accident." And he said, "Right, I'm going to sell it." So he had told Professor Brass that he was going to sell the car he had just given his wife. And therefore I bought this magnificent Volkswagen, which was just 3 months old, for a wonderful bargain price. And that Volkswagen took Maureen and me all around Jamaica. We traveled hundreds of miles every week because we went into the mountains constantly. But coming back to work, I did my pathology job, and that was a fascinating exercise, because in my pathology job, what I often had to do was to act on behalf of other junior colleagues. I was always, if you like, a bit of a rebel. I was always a spokesman. I was always the person who was called upon to represent the group. And one morning at coffee break in the pathology department, a couple of senior doctors and my buddy, now Professor Peter Figueroa, the AIDS guru of the Caribbean, we were having coffee together and discussing medical issues. And one of the issues that we were discussing was the fallout of doctors at the university hospital. You see, Jamaica was going through a terrible economic crunch in 1970, and doctors were leaving the hospital for several reasons. One of them was the lack of modernization of equipment. One of them was lack of supplies, where you wanted to take a blood sample from a patient and you couldn't find the right tubes or the syringes. And the other big thing was the fact that the university was not training people in postgraduate specialties. Now, the university, as I may have mentioned, was set up and opened in 1948 to train doctors, period. There was an assumption somehow that all of the specialists would continue to come out from Britain, and the surgeons and the teachers and so on would always be British. Well, this was a very naive colonial view. And we recognized that our doctors, our young doctors, were leaving the university hospital, leaving Jamaica, leaving Barbados, and going off to North America to get their postgraduate training in the subjects that they wanted to do, whether it was surgery or psychiatry or medicine or pediatrics. And so that group sitting there decided that something had to be done. And we called ourselves, this little nucleus, the Action Group. And we brought in now Professor Sir Errol Walron, who was a young lecturer at the time and a very inspiring young lecturer. And so we had a range of people. It was mostly 2 or 3 junior doctors, one eloquent medical student, and a couple of lecturers. We called ourselves the Action Group, and we petitioned the faculty, say, look, the Caribbean is losing its doctors because we have no postgraduate training. And the university, by good fortune, happened to have contacts with the Hope Ship. Now, the Hope Ship was an American charity ship that moved around the world in different places, and it would station itself, anchor itself off a city in a developing country and provide skills, especially surgical skills that we didn't have, things like cataract surgery, which were more advanced than in the Caribbean. And with the Hope Ship's efforts and collaboration, a partnership was formed, and our Action Group produced postgraduate training. And the postgraduate training formally began in 1972 as a result of that Action Group, led by medical student Peter Figueroa and myself, with the help of a couple of senior people. It was a very, very important development. I continued my own postgraduate training with a year of metabolic research with Sir George Aline, and I had previously talked about my medical student days doing an elective with him and learning how to cannulate rats. And that was an interesting piece of work which gave me my first medical paper. But I then did a year of metabolic research looking at malnourished rats. You see, Jamaica had this tremendous problem of infant malnutrition, and what Sir George was working on was the effects of malnutrition on different organs. I had done my elective on the liver, but we now were looking at the kidney. So I had the task of creating malnourished rats, which conform to the 2 characteristic types of malnutrition. Calorie deprivation, where mommy just doesn't have enough milk and she doesn't have enough money to buy the food for the infant. And then we had protein deprivation, where mommy would feed the child on mostly calories, and cornmeal pap was something popular, but it didn't have essential amino acids. So you had one form of malnutrition where the child looked like a skeleton, the kind of skeletons that you see out of the Eastern Africa in times of famine and so on, that starved looking infant. And then you had the protein deficient child who tended to have edema around the body and didn't look as skeletal. He got lots of calories, but he didn't build his muscle, and it affected how the organs behaved. So my research was looking at the organs of the kidney. And we had one dramatic incident once, because Sir George Aline was a man who started work early and worked very late. And one day I left the gas on, and he came in to start his experiment. earlier, and he beat me to it, and he found that the cylinder of gas was empty. And I thought, man, he is going to be really, really angry. And he taught me how to control anger, because he said in the most gentle way, you have spoilt my day. I cannot do my experiments today. And he said, just don't let it happen again. Of course, it never happened again. But it was a wonderful way of learning how to rebuke someone. And then I went on after my research period, which I really very much enjoyed. I then went on to do a year of medicine, which was done in what we call the middle grade in medicine. The team for managing patients in a hospital in tertiary care comprises the consultant who is in charge, the senior guy who's got the specialty qualifications, the middle grade guy who is in formal training, and then the intern, the person who's doing his immediate post-graduation internship. He's the dog's body. He's the gopher. He's the guy who does all the scut work. He's the guy who takes the bloods, clerks the patients, looks after the patient's initial admission, and then seeks the advice of the senior boys. And so teaching rounds are done with the consultant doing most of the teaching, the registrar absorbing, and then he goes on and teaches, and the intern completing the team. Now, we worked in a team like that, and I had Sir George Alleyne as my consultant most of that time, and the now late Professor George Nicholson. And they were both kidney specialists. So they worked very hard to persuade me to be a kidney specialist. But I didn't want to be a kidney specialist. I had a different view. My organ of preference was the liver. I was fascinated by the liver. The liver does so many amazing things. So I was more fascinated by that. But during that period, we had some exciting times. We had amazing patients. We had a patient that I was very fortunate to diagnose, and I'll pause to tell you about it. Sometimes you have to do what you have to do, even though it may not seem to be your job. I had a patient where a surgeon in Port Antonio called me as the registrar on duty and said, I have a patient I just cannot manage. I have a patient who seems to have abdominal pain, but I can't find anything, and whatever medication we give seems to make it worse. And I can't handle this anymore. Can I send him over to the hospital? So he sent him over to the university hospital by ambulance. And after a 2.5-hour ambulance ride, this guy had a desperate need to empty his bladder. So I am there talking to him and trying to find out what his medical story is, when he says, Doc, I had to pee. Doc, I had to pee. Now, normally, most doctors would probably say to the nearby nurse, Nurse, assist this gentleman. Let him pass his bladder, and I'll come back and complete the examination. So I said no. I asked the nurse to get me a urine bottle, and I assisted him. And when he peed, what came out of his bladder was the color of your shirt. It was a brilliant royal purple. And that only occurs in one condition, a rare genetic condition called porphyria, which produces all kinds of symptoms, interacts with many drugs, especially barbiturates, and is reputed to have been the disease that made George III somewhat crazy for many years of his life back in the early 18th century. And if I had not assisted that patient in having his pee, I would not have made the diagnosis that easily. So it was a wonderful experience in medicine. And there were other experiences like that which were very interesting. One of them was the fact that Professor Nicholson and I were able to see enough patients with what is called disseminated gonococcus. Now, gonorrhea is a sexually transmitted disease, an STD, and gonorrhea produces what many men would call a leak. It infects the sexual organs, and it can be passed by one person to another through sexual activity. And what we discovered was that there was a bit of an outbreak of a very infectious gonorrhea, which was being inadequately treated, because people would go to the pharmacy and say, Doc, I got a leak, and the pharmacy would give him 2 antibiotic tablets, which might have suppressed the symptoms for a day, but did not cure it. and the man would then transmit it to his partner. And so we collected and we published that wonderful paper on what was then considered very unusual, because gonorrhea was common in the old days, and with penicillin it had been virtually eliminated. But this had resurged in Jamaica, was not being adequately treated, and we were able to publish a very interesting paper on it. And one of those subjects, I have to tell you, was the wife of a priest in Kingston. He had been one of those priests who counsels his parishioners in every which way, including emotional and sexual ways, and he had taken the gonorrhea home to his wife. So that's the kind of thing that you have in medicine, you know. And it's wonderful to cure and resolve these things, that, especially when other doctors might have missed it. That's one of the exciting things about becoming a specialist. And Cicero said, you know, man is closer to God when he's able to bring good health to people. And so the richness of that environment in Jamaica, where there was so much ill health and so many undiagnosed problems that we could solve at the University Hospital of the West Indies, which was, in a sense, very much the intellectual center for medicine in the whole Caribbean, receiving patients even from Barbados. And while I was a registrar, I certainly had patients who were sent up from Barbados. My wife, on the other hand, she went into pediatrics. She thought that she would be a pediatrician. But the pediatric setting was not the ideal one. And she decided, no, she would take a break from pediatrics, and she went into preventive medicine with my much older friend and mentor, Sir Kenneth Standard. And Sir Kenneth Standard was a powerful hero of the 20th century. He was a wonderful Barbadian man and was a mentor both to me and to my wife, who joined his department. And in his department, she discovered an awful lot of patients with skin disease, and that really excited her. And so she moved from there into dermatology, and she spent our remaining year and a half in dermatology in Jamaica. And then she had the brilliant idea, well, to be a dermatologist in the English-speaking world, you have to go to the Mecca of dermatology. So she wrote to the Mecca of dermatology, which is the Institute of Dermatology in London. And they wrote back, and with her qualifications from Aberdeen, her experience in Jamaica, they accepted her to do this very special full 12-month diploma in dermatology, which all the British dermatologists did. And so I then had the task, if she was going to London to do dermatology, I had to find a way of going to London to do dermatology too. And this is where I go back to one of the things I said early in perhaps the first part of this interview about opportunity and good luck turning up. Because I wanted to be an internist, and I wanted to specialize, if possible, in liver disease. And by chance, strictly by chance, I went with Sir George Alleyne to the American Federation Proceedings meeting in Atlantic City. And there I met an English gastroenterologist, and I said, how does one get into Britain to train in gastroenterology? And he said, it's quite simple. You write to Professor Sir Christopher Booth at the Royal Postgraduate Medical School, and he is very interested in people from the Commonwealth. So I wrote to Sir Christopher Booth, and Sir Christopher Booth said to me, well, Dr. Fraser, I will be in London on the 19th and 20th of August. And that's the only time I'm going to be in London during the summer. So if you want an interview, you've got to find yourself in London on the 19th or 20th of August. Now, in those days, junior doctors were paid very little. We had no money, we had no savings, nothing. So how was I going to get to London? Luckily, Fatty, Mrs. Rousseau, had a friend who had organized a chartered flight to London so that Jamaicans could go up to London and see their friends who had emigrated 10 years earlier. And I was lucky to get onto that chartered flight, but it meant that I had to spend a month in London. Anyway, I met Sir Christopher Booth, and this is one of the opportunities and bits of good luck that determines your entire life. Because Sir Christopher Booth was born in Yorkshire, the birthplace of a very famous English doctor called William Hillary. And Sir Christopher was fascinated by the story of William Hillary, William Hillary, having trained in England and in Germany, and then worked in Bath and done some research on smallpox, was actually a Quaker. He discovered that in Barbados there was an active Quaker group, and he was challenged by the idea of coming to Barbados. So he spent 10 years here from 1747 to 1757. And Sir Christopher Booth, coming to give a lecture in Trinidad, was so fascinated by this man that he had written to the Barbados Museum saying, do you have a first edition of this book that he wrote in 1762? Because he wanted to see a first edition. He personally had a second edition, but a first edition was extremely rare. He discovered the Barbados Museum had a first edition, and he made a specific trip to Barbados to see the first edition of Dr. William Hillary's book on the epidemical diseases of Barbados, and that made him kind of connected with Barbados. So when a Barbadian asks him for a job, he said, come and see me. And he gave me that job. And that job was the opening to so many things, my connections with the Royal Postgraduate Medical School, which was the center of Britain. And it sort of illustrates what Bill Gates would say. You don't necessarily have to climb every step on a ladder. If you can find a way to just jump to the higher rung, that's often a wonderful thing to be able to do. And he got me subsequent jobs. I went to the Institute of Neurology to do my neurology because I thought that was essential for every good doctor in the Caribbean, because we had a huge shortage, a great shortage. There was one neurologist in the entire Caribbean of more than 6 million people. So I had a job in neurology, which was absolutely fascinating. I was given, because I was a West Indian, and I would not be looking for a job in Britain, I was given the pick of the jobs, junior jobs, at the Institute of Neurology in central London. And I worked with the three professors, Professor Roger Gilead, Professor MacDonald, and Professor Marshall. It was an amazing scenario of medicine in which rank was hugely important. At the conferences in neurology, the front row was for the professors and the senior consultants. The next row was for the middle grade consultants, the next row the junior consultants, the next row the middle grade doctors, the registrars, and finally the most junior doctors of all, and then the hangers on. And I remember an occasion when 2 American elective students were attending the Institute of Neurology, and they rushed into the meeting, and they absent-mindedly, not knowing, not being experienced, not being educated about it, they took 2 seats in the front row, and Professor Gilead went to them and said, up and around, and pointed them to the back row. But Professor Gilead was a very interesting man. He had been the best man at the wedding of Princess Margaret and Anthony Armstrong Jones. He was that kind of upper-class aristocratic Englishman. And you didn't speak to him until he spoke to you. He was very dogmatic, he was very specific and precise, you might say obsessive-compulsive. And there was an occasion in which I had an opinion about a patient when we did the rounds, and he had a different opinion. And I made my case very strongly. And he sort of grumbled and mumbled and so on. And at the end of the ward round, he went down to his office and he did some checking. And he sent his secretary up to the ward to tell me, Professor Gilead has sent me to apologize and to say that you were right. And she was red in her face and panting, and she said, I've never known him ever do anything like this before. You know, when I met him 10 or 12 years later at, in a hotel where there was a conference, he was the most charming, relaxed, retired man. You would not believe it was the same person. But this is what medicine is like, you see. Medicine is full of prima donnas who become intellectually very expert, and they don't like to be challenged. Whereas I've always felt my role was to educate, to inspire, to encourage, and to bring the younger people along, and that's what I did subsequently. But that experience was terrific. Meanwhile, Maureen did her diploma, became a very, very well qualified dermatologist, and she went on to work as a registrar, middle grade doctor at the Institute of Neurology with Professor Wilson and others, while I went back to the postgraduate medical school at Hammersmith And I had a welcome fellowship which Sir George Allen organized for me. And he encouraged me to go into clinical pharmacology because he said, since you are interested in research, one of the best ways of getting funding is research in drugs, because this was the era of the 1970s. There was an absolute explosion in drug development at that time. So I went back to Hammersmith and I worked with the famous Sir Colin Dollery, who was the chairman of the Committee of Safety of Medicines in Britain, a great researcher, a specialist in hypertension. And I did a lot of work, therefore. My clinical service was general medicine plus high blood pressure. My own research was on variation in human drug response. So I did a wonderful thesis for my PhD. I did laboratory as well as clinical, as well as epidemiology research. I was looking at how the liver metabolized specific drugs, which meant that I had to do biopsies of the liver with a long needle, and I had to collect urine, and I had to use very tiny samples of liver and measure the metabolism taking place in the liver cells, and I had to see what the product was in the urine and try to correlate these things. And then I was looking at variation in the human population. So I sampled a British population, a kind of convenient sample, but it required a matched sample of white or Caucasian English people, Asian people who worked in many of these factories as general workers in the factory operating machines or secretarial, clerical kind of work. So there were lots of Asian ladies especially. So I had Asian and white workers as part of my sample in London. And then I had to find a sample of a black population. And Sir Colin suggested that if we could find a rural population, then we'd have another element of comparison, a rural African population versus an urban Asian and white population. So I went out to Gambia, and that was a dramatic, amazing experience.
And we'll continue to learn of Sir Henry's trip to Gambia as a research fellow in the next program. This has been Sir Henry Fraser, His Life in Focus. I'm Miles Eversley. Do take care and thanks for your time.